It began with a failed student, a vision, and the belief that heaven had chosen him. What followed was not a protest. It was not a coup. It was one of the bloodiest human collapses ever recorded. Subscribe to Fragments of History, because history hides its worst disasters in silence. China in the early 19th century was the most populated empire on Earth. More than 400 million people lived under Qing rule, more than the populations of Europe and North America combined. That scale was power. It was also a weakness. An empire that held more lives than any other could fail in more places at the same time, without anyone in the capital understanding what was breaking. The Qing dynasty was stretched past its ability to govern what it owned. Its territory ran from the coasts to Central Asia, from the tropical south to the frozen north. Messages moved slowly. Orders left Beijing and took weeks to reach distant provinces, if they arrived at all. By the time they did, local officials had already rewritten them, ignored them, or turned them into something else entirely. On paper, the state was unified. In practice, it was a set of loose connections held together by ritual and habit. Policies existed, but did not land. Laws were issued, but not enforced. The bureaucracy meant to bind center to periphery had become corrupt, inefficient, and increasingly indifferent to the people beneath it. From the outside, the empire looked solid. Inside, it was splitting along unseen seams. Poverty wasn't an exception, it was a condition. The population had grown faster than the economy could sustain. Farmland that had fed families for generations was divided and divided again until the plots were too small to keep a household alive. Peasants worked until their bodies gave out and still could not feed their children. Those who left the countryside found cities already swollen with migrants, crowded streets, thin wages, and no room for new arrivals to breathe. Famine returned with a brutal regularity. Harvests failed for reasons the poor could not control. Weather, floods, neglected infrastructure. When the grain ran out, starvation followed. In theory, relief systems existed to move food to the worst-hit regions. In reality, corruption choked them. Grain meant for survival was siphoned away, sold or stored for profit. People learned to understand the state in its most basic form. It could tax them, and it could abandon them. Corruption touched everything. Posts were bought, not earned. Officials collected bribes from the people below and paid bribes to the people above. Tax demands shifted with the appetite of whoever arrived to collect them. A peasant could obey every rule and still be ruined. The system was not built to serve the population. It was built to feed itself. And because corruption was income, reform was sabotage waiting to happen. When the center attempted to change anything, local officials resisted, not out of ideology, but out of survival. Reforms threatened the networks that paid them. The same men tasked with implementing change were the ones who profited from preventing it. The empire tried to correct its course using hands that were tied to the old rot. Modern pressures were closing in. Western powers arrived with superior military technology and imposed humiliating treaties. Inside the Qing court, reformers argued for adopting Western methods, modern weapons, industry, new education. But conservatives saw this as a violation of the traditional order, and corrupt administrators saw it as a threat to the machinery of bribes and favors. Modernization did not fail for lack of necessity. It failed because it threatened too many people who still had power. Even the imperial examination system, once the empire's proud instrument of merit, was becoming a factory for dysfunction. It produced graduates trained in classical texts and literary precision, but unprepared for the realities of administration and crisis. Young men spent years memorizing the past, not learning how to govern the present. Those who passed entered office with status, not competence. Those who failed lost years of life and often their minds with it. In the countryside, the relationship between state and peasant felt purely extractive. Taxes were collected. Young men were conscripted when needed. But roads decayed. Flood controls weakened. Courts favored the connected. Protection vanished when it mattered. When the state appeared, it appeared to take. When people begged for help, it did not arrive. Resentment spread through every layer of society. Peasants hated landlords who owned the land they worked. Landlords hated officials who bled them dry. Merchants watched instability disrupt trade and blamed both. Urban workers saw foreign goods undercut local production and felt the floor drop out beneath them. Intellectuals looked at a rigid system offering no path for change and felt the suffocation of stagnation. In this vacuum, secret societies multiplied. They weren't always political. Many were survival networks, mutual protection, dispute resolution, community outside official structures. Some turned criminal, others turned religious. Most were mixtures. The government tried to crush them, and the harder it struck, the deeper they went underground, and the more necessary they became to people the state had already abandoned. Religious heterodoxy spread beside them. Established traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, were still present, but they no longer answered every hunger. New syncretic beliefs rose, combining elements from multiple traditions. Some absorbed Christian ideas carried by missionaries. These movements offered meaning where daily life offered only loss. They promised order, purification, transformation. They filled a spiritual space the empire could not police. Violence was already there, but it was contained. Banditry grew because starving people stole to live. Clans fought over land and water. Secret societies clashed with each other and with officials. But it was local, measured in dozens or hundreds. It was the background noise of a strained society, not yet the sound of collapse. The Qing dynasty was not falling in a dramatic, visible way. It was hollowing out. The bureaucracy still stood. The court still performed its ceremonies. Armies still marched. Yet the institutions were increasingly shells, corrupt, unresponsive, incapable of relieving the pressures building in every province. The population was not primed for upheaval because it had embraced revolutionary ideology. It was primed because it was desperate. Millions lived one failed harvest away from starvation, one predatory official away from ruin, one personal crisis away from having nothing left to lose. They didn't need theory. They needed hope sharp enough to cut through fear, and leaders willing to speak it as certainty. China had become a pressure vessel with failing seals. It looked stable because it was enormous, because suffering was dispersed across vast distances, because no single crisis had yet broken the whole. But the pressure was rising. Resentment was accumulating. Desperation was spreading. What it needed was not an invasion or a palace coup. The system had learned to endure those. It needed something that could gather diffuse anger and make it move as one body. It needed someone willing to tell millions that heaven had chosen them. And once that message took hold, the empire would not simply face rebellion. It would face a collapse that would swallow everything in its path. Hong Xiuquan was born in 1814 to a Hakka family in Guangdong. The Hakka were an ethnic minority within China, often discriminated against, often pushed to the margins. His family had little money, but a single, desperate ambition: educate the boy, send him into the imperial examinations, and let the state turn poverty into status. For people like them, it was the only door that might open. Hong was intelligent and relentless. He buried himself in classical texts, memorizing lines, until they replaced sleep. The exams were not just tests, they were verdicts. Pass, and you rose. Fail, and you returned home carrying nothing but shame. In 1836, at 23, he traveled to Canton for the provincial examination, the first real barrier between ambition and a life in the mud. He failed. He tried again, and again, and again. Each failure did more than bruise him. It reached backward, into the hands that had paid for his study. Relatives who could not afford generosity had given anyway. A family that could not spare a future had wagered it on him. Every time he returned without success, he returned with proof that their sacrifice had been wasted. The pressure did not ease with repetition. It tightened, The examinations were designed to crush anything human. Candidates were locked into tiny cells for days, writing essays in prescribed forms on prescribed texts. Creativity was punished. Originality was deviation. Success meant perfect reproduction of orthodoxy. Hong was capable, smart enough to understand the machinery, but never exceptional enough to win inside it. By his fourth failure in 1843, the system had cornered him. He was nearly 30, too old to be a promising student, too educated to return to peasant labor, too poor to become anything else. A decade of study had produced no position, no security, no identity beyond failure. He became one more educated man with nowhere to go, in an empire full of them. Then he collapsed, not in spirit, on the ground. Witnesses described a severe fever, delirium, weeks of drifting in and out of consciousness. His family waited for him to die. Instead, he emerged claiming he had been taken to heaven. He described visions with unnerving clarity. An old man with a golden beard, identifying himself as God the Father. A younger man, introduced as his elder brother. A sword, a seal. Demons loose on earth, corrupting everything. A command: destroy them, cleanse the world, establish a heavenly kingdom. Years earlier in Canton, Hong had encountered Christian missionary pamphlets. He had read them without devotion, absorbing only fragments: one God, heaven and hell, a holy war against evil. Those concepts had lain dormant. After his illness, they rose to the surface and locked onto his visions like a key finding a waiting door. Hong concluded he was Jesus Christ's younger brother. The old man was God. The younger man was Jesus. Hong was the second son sent to China to finish what had been left undone, and the demons were not symbols. They were the Manchu rulers of the Qing dynasty, devils oppressing the true children of God. This was not Christianity as the missionaries knew it. They would later recoil from his theology. But it was a potent fusion. Chinese spiritual instincts combined with a stark Christian frame, forming a story that explained suffering in cosmic terms. Hong wasn't offering doctrine. He was offering meaning to people who could not find it anywhere else. He began to preach, not like a scholar. Like a man delivering a verdict, he did not argue, he declared. He told peasants and laborers that their misery was not proof of failure, it was proof of oppression, that they were not forgotten, they were chosen, that a demonic regime ruled them, and that heaven itself demanded its destruction. The message struck like intoxication in lives that had been starved of hope. At first his listeners were close, family, neighbors, those who watched him with fear and pity, but his certainty hardened. His language sharpened, and strangers began to gather, men like Hong, ruined by the examination system, peasants pushed off land, craftsmen without work, the displaced and the discarded. People who had learned the empire would not rescue them, and who were ready to believe rescue could come from somewhere else. The movement began as a religious sect, but its implications were immediate and lethal. Hong preached the Qing were not merely corrupt rulers. They were illegitimate by nature, an unholy force that God commanded be overthrown. Rebellion became more than politics. It became a sacred duty. Violence became spiritual warfare. He built community through rituals and rules. Followers destroyed ancestral tablets and Confucian texts, calling them idolatry. They refused traditional ceremonies. They separated themselves from mainstream society, socially, religiously, and increasingly physically. This separation created bonds inside the group and clear boundaries against the world outside. The desperate were drawn in: famine refugees, unemployed laborers, bandits, outcasts. Hong told them their suffering was not random and not deserved. It was a test, preparation for a kingdom they would inherit on earth. Pain became evidence. Misery became prophecy. And when suffering becomes meaningful, people stop fearing how much more they can endure. Hong's charisma was specific and dangerous. He was not a sophisticated thinker. He was not a strategist, but he possessed absolute certainty, emotional intensity, and a rare ability to make invisible people feel seen. In a society built to ignore them, being valued by a prophet who claimed heaven's authority was power beyond reason. As the sect grew, it organized. Early followers became lieutenants with religious titles. Hierarchies formed. Resources were pooled. This was no longer a loose gathering of believers. It was becoming an institution. Disciplined, coordinated, capable, faith was turning into command. Local authorities noticed a movement preaching the dynasty's demonic nature and attracting thousands was not a curiosity, it was a threat. They tried suppression, arrests, dispersals, pressure on communities to expel the God-worshippers. But suppression required a state that could move cleanly and decisively, and the Qing administration was neither. In distant rural districts, weakness is a language everyone understands. When persecution came, it backfired. Arrested followers became martyrs. Dispersed gatherings reappeared elsewhere. Every act of pressure confirmed Hong's claim that the dynasty opposed God's will. The state's attempts to crush the sect became evidence that the sect was right. By the late 1840s, the God-worshippers numbered in the tens of thousands, with footholds across multiple provinces. They were organized, committed, and increasingly militant. Hong's preaching had shifted from salvation to urgency. The heavenly kingdom was no longer a distant promise. It was an immediate project that demanded action. And in 1850, when Qing forces finally moved to suppress the God-worshippers decisively, the believers did not scatter. They fought back, and they won. The God-worshippers were not a cult in the passive sense. They did not retreat from the world. They moved into it, organized, disciplined, and hungry for territory. By 1850, what had begun as scattered religious communities was hardening into a coordinated force, capable of striking at imperial authority. The change came fast because the movement offered what desperate people were already searching for: structure, purpose, and the promise that victory was not only possible, it was ordained. Their rejection of Qing rule was absolute. There would be no petitions, no reforms, no compromise. The dynasty was not merely corrupt in their eyes, it was demonic. Cooperation became sin. Paying taxes was serving devils. Obeying Qing law was betrayal. Loyalty to the emperor was spiritual treason. The message erased middle ground and left only a binary choice: join or stand against heaven. Inside the movement, strict moral codes marked believers off from the society around them. Opium was forbidden. The drug forced into China by British trade was labeled poison of demons. Gambling was banned. Prostitution was eliminated in God-worshipper territory. Alcohol was restricted. These were not ideals. They were laws. And the laws were enforced with violence. Those caught with opium were beaten or executed. Gamblers had their hands broken. Anyone holding to traditional practices, burning incense, keeping ancestral tablets, faced public humiliation, the destruction of property, and the threat of worse. A moral police state emerged, and deviation from Hong's teachings became physically dangerous. For many, that brutality did not repel. It reassured. The Qing world they knew was drenched in corruption, officials taking bribes while the poor starved, rules bent for the connected, punishment reserved for the powerless. The God-worshippers offered something different: authoritarian, yes, but not corrupt. Rules applied to everyone. Enforcement was consistent. In a society accustomed to predatory authority, consistency could feel like justice. To some, it even looked like purity. Recruitment accelerated as success fed belief. Early converts pulled in families, neighbors, and entire villages. Hong's message rode existing networks: kinship ties, trade routes, secret societies. The movement did not need to persuade individuals one by one. It absorbed communities in blocks, creating instant mass and instant loyalty. The desperate arrived in waves: famine refugees fleeing starvation, unemployed miners, displaced peasants, ethnic minorities like the Hakka who had been pushed aside for generations. Among the god-worshippers, they were not treated as disposable. They were given purpose. They were promised not only salvation, but material transformation, redistributed land, dignity, and a place inside a rising order. As whole communities converted, militias formed almost on their own. Farmers took up improvised weapons and drilled. Discipline spread through habit and fear, and women participated in ways traditional society did not permit, fighting, organizing logistics, holding authority. The god-worshippers preached gender equality as divine command, and in doing so they mobilized power that the old world had locked away. These militias were not professional troops, but they carried advantages the Qing forces did not. They fought for belief rather than wages. They knew local terrain. They were fed by sympathetic communities that provided shelter, intelligence, and supplies. Most of all, they were many. Imperial soldiers were trained, but the believers outnumbered the forces sent to break them, and they were willing to die without hesitation. The first clashes went better than anyone expected. In 1850, when Qing troops attempted to arrest Hong and disperse the movement, the believers fought back and won. Government soldiers were killed, weapons were seized. For the first time, the dynasty's power cracked in the open. The Qing had always seemed unbreakable. Now it had bled. That victory changed the atmosphere. Villages that had hesitated watched the god-worshippers defeat imperial troops and began to calculate survival differently. Communities crushed by officials and taxes saw an alternative that could protect itself. The movement's reputation traveled faster than the army itself, spreading fear through the administration and hope through those who had nothing left to defend. By 1851, the god-worshippers held significant territory in Guangxi. Qing administrators were pushed out. Land was redistributed. Local governance shifted into Taiping hands. This was no longer a religious sect with armed followers. It was a proto-state, territory, population, authority, functioning outside the dynasty. In January 1851, Hong declared the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Taiping meant great peace. The peace that would come after God's will was imposed on earth. Hong proclaimed himself the Heavenly King, divinely appointed to replace demonic rule with legitimate authority. This was not framed as rebellion. It was framed as restoration, heaven correcting a corrupted world. Then the movement began to take cities, not villages, walled urban centers, places that required siege, coordination, supply lines, and command. Each captured city proved the same point. These were not rioters or bandits. They were becoming an army. Yongan fell in September 1851. After a siege, the god-worshippers held it for months, despite repeated Qing attempts to retake it. Inside, they formalized control. Hong appointed kings beneath himself, military commanders with royal titles and administrative power. A bureaucracy took shape to manage people and resources under Taiping rule. The movement was building governance in the middle of war. The campaign grew bolder. In 1852, Taiping forces moved north, taking city after city. Guilin resisted and was bypassed, but dozens of smaller centers fell. Each victory brought grain stores, weapons, and new recruits. The army expanded as it advanced, absorbing the populations it claimed to liberate. By 1853, Taiping forces numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Qing response was slow and disordered. Imperial forces were dispersed, poorly coordinated, and often corrupted from within. Commanders embezzled funds. Soldiers went unpaid and underfed. Morale collapsed. Against them stood Taiping troops driven by religious certainty and led by commanders elevated for ability rather than connections. In March 1853, the Taiping reached the Yangtze River and captured Nanjing, one of China's most important cities and a former capital of the Ming. This was not merely a military success, it was symbolic seizure. Nanjing carried the weight of legitimacy. Holding it meant the Taiping were no longer an uprising at the edges. They were a rival government claiming to rule China. With Nanjing taken, everything shifted. A rebellion became a state. The Taiping now controlled China's wealthiest region, ruled millions, and held a capital that would take years of war to pry from them. They were not insurgents hiding in mountains. They were power planted in the center of the empire. Hong established his court in the city. Palaces were converted for the Heavenly Kingdom's leadership. Nanjing was renamed Heavenly Capital. Administrative systems were expanded. Laws were issued, taxes were collected. An alternative China was being constructed inside the shell of the Qing world. In less than 3 years, a failed student's visions had turned into territorial conquest. Millions now lived under Taiping rule. An army, hundreds of thousands strong, held provinces and cities and declared a new mandate. And from the heavenly capital, Hong would begin imposing his vision of paradise on earth, whether the people wanted it or not. Nanjing became the heavenly capital, Tianjin in Taiping language. A city that had held more than 1 million people under Qing rule was remade into the center of a theocratic experiment that grew more authoritarian by the month. The god-worshippers had taken territory to build a utopia. What emerged instead was a religious dictatorship that began consuming the very population it claimed to redeem. The government was openly theocratic. Hong Xiuquan ruled as the heavenly king, claiming direct communication with God. His word was revelation, not policy. Beneath him stood other kings, the eastern, western, southern, and northern, each commanding armies and administering territory. But all authority ran upward. Hong answered to no council, no tradition, no law beyond what he declared to be heaven's will. That structure removed every restraint. Nothing could override the heavenly king. Nothing could correct him. Edicts poured out, military orders, social rules, personal prohibitions, and each arrived stamped with divinity. Disagreement was not opposition. It was heresy. Inside Tianjin, the Taiping imposed radical policies that tore through every familiar rhythm of Chinese life. Gender separation came first, enforced with shocking completeness. Men and women were divided into separate residential zones, separate work units, separate military formations. Husbands and wives were split. Families were fractured. Contact between genders became a crime, permitted only in narrow, approved contexts. Officially, this was spiritual purity, preparation for a celestial order. In practice, it was control. Break families, and you weaken private loyalty, separate spouses, and you eliminate a world that exists outside state supervision. Destroy the household, and the population becomes dependent on the movement for food, shelter, work, permission to exist. The family, the oldest social unit in China, was treated as a rival power that had to be dismantled. At the same time, women were mobilized in unprecedented ways. They fought in separate units, worked in female brigades, held administrative roles. The Taiping proclaimed gender equality as divine principle, and in structure it looked revolutionary. But it unfolded inside a totalitarian system where equality meant equal submission. Everyone was subject to religious authority. Everyone was watched. Private property was abolished. Land, wealth, possessions, everything was claimed by the heavenly treasury and redistributed through the state. Farmers did not own fields. They worked collectively and received rations. Merchants did not own goods. They functioned as agents, not proprietors. It was presented as holy communalism. It operated as confiscation, and it was not equal. While the general population lived on subsistence rations, leadership occupied comfort and privilege. Hong's palace compound was extravagant, filled with concubines, even as ordinary people were forced into strict gender separation. The kings lived similarly. The rhetoric spoke of purity and equality. The reality was hierarchy, with religious authority translating directly into material power. Ideological purity was enforced with violence. The Taiping demanded absolute adherence to their version of Christianity. Traditional practices were outlawed. Temples were destroyed. Buddhist and Taoist texts were burned. Ancestral worship became a crime. Anyone caught holding to old beliefs faced severe punishment. A movement that had promised liberation imposed a uniformity more intrusive than anything the Qing had attempted. Education was sealed under the same control. Children learned Taiping doctrine and propaganda. Classical Chinese texts, the foundation of traditional learning, were banned as pagan corruption. The old examination system was replaced with tests on biblical knowledge and Taiping theology. An entire generation was being cut from its intellectual inheritance and rewired for obedience. Surveillance filled the gaps between laws. The population was organized into units where members monitored one another. Reporting suspected disloyalty became duty. Failure to report became guilt. Trust turned into liability. Everyone learned to speak carefully, to hide thoughts, to measure faces. Paranoia was not a disorder. It was a survival skill. Crimes against the religious order were punished with public brutality. Executions were staged, beheadings, dismemberments, burnings. These were not only punishments, they were performances designed to teach the crowd what obedience costs and what dissent earns. Bodies were displayed. Warnings were made physical. Entire families could die for one person's transgression. Mercy was treated as weakness, and weakness as sin. The Taiping leadership, meanwhile, grew isolated and afraid. They saw conspiracies everywhere because conspiracies existed everywhere. Families resented their forced separation. Communities resented confiscation. People resented the violent imposition of an alien religious order. That resentment produced resistance, and resistance produced more repression. The state tightened, the population hardened, and the spiral fed itself. Internal purges began almost immediately. The Eastern king, Yang Xiuqing, claimed to channel God's voice, and used that claim to challenge Hong's authority. In 1856, the struggle ended in the Tianjin incident, a massive purge in which Yang and thousands of followers were massacred. The killing lasted for days. The heavenly capital became a slaughterhouse. The heavenly kingdom devoured its own leadership. It was not an exception. It was a pattern. Anyone who accumulated power became a target. Commanders were executed for insufficient victories. Administrators were killed for suspected disloyalty. Brotherhood collapsed into a politics of preemptive murder. Eliminate rivals before they eliminate you. For the population inside Taiping territory, life became forced labor, indoctrination, constant surveillance, and the permanent shadow of punishment. The heavenly kingdom was not liberation. It was a different kind of captivity, more intimate, more invasive. Many who had once supported the movement began to long for Qing restoration, not out of loyalty, but because the old oppression had been less total. Escape was treated as treason. Deserters were hunted and executed publicly. Their families were punished. Borders were controlled so tightly that leaving without permission was nearly impossible, and permission was rarely granted. The heavenly kingdom did not simply govern, it enclosed. The Taiping revealed a fatal logic at the core of ideologically pure revolution. When you believe you are executing heaven's will, compromise becomes betrayal. When your authority comes from God, dissent becomes demonic. The certainty that made the movement powerful in rebellion made it monstrous in power. Hong himself drifted further from reality. He retreated into his palace compound, spending more time with concubines than governing. He issued edicts based on supposed revelations, commands that grew stranger as the pressure outside intensified. He believed absolutely that he was God's son, that the Taiping would rule all China, that victory was guaranteed by heaven, and the leadership around him could not admit doubt without collapsing the entire foundation of their rule. Meanwhile, the territories under Taiping control began to erode. Agriculture faltered under forced collectivization and conscription. Trade suffocated under Qing blockade. What the Taiping held, they consumed. What they consumed, they did not replace. The heavenly kingdom was feeding on itself. And while Tianjin tried to manufacture paradise through force, the rest of China was burning, drawn into a war that would kill more people than any conflict in human history until the 20th century. The Taiping Rebellion was not fought on clean battlefields with clear boundaries. It was a total war that devoured entire regions, erasing the line between soldier and civilian, between battlefield and home. It spread across southern and central China like a slow catastrophe, methodical, accumulating, destroying everything it touched and producing death on a scale that broke comprehension. Civilians were trapped from the beginning. In Taiping territory, life meant submission to a religious dictatorship. In Qing-held regions, imperial forces treated anyone who might sympathize as an enemy. And in contested land, where much of the war actually lived, people faced violence from both sides. There was no safe position, because safety required neutrality, and neutrality was no longer possible. Cities became death traps. Siege warfare turned urban centers into cages where starvation was the weapon. The Taiping surrounded Qing-held cities, cut off supplies, and waited for hunger to force surrender. The Qing did the same to Taiping cities. These were not campaigns in the old sense. They were slow-motion mass killing, where armies watched civilians die and called it strategy. Anqing endured 16 months. The city ate itself from the edges inward. Pets, leather, tree bark, rats. When even that was gone, cannibalism appeared. Parents killed children to eat them. The dead were butchered before burial. When surrender finally came, survivors were skeletal figures, barely recognizable as human. Tens of thousands died without a battle, killed by time, confinement, and the deliberate absence of food. Nanjing was besieged repeatedly, and the final Qing siege lasted for years. The city that had held more than 1 million people before the Taiping captured it was reduced to perhaps 100,000 by the time it fell in 1864. The rest were gone. Starvation, disease, execution, massacre. Corpses lay in streets because the living no longer had the strength to bury the dead. Mass executions became routine. When the Taiping took a city, Qing officials and soldiers were killed, along with anyone suspected of loyalty to the dynasty. When the Qing recaptured territory, they slaughtered Taiping soldiers and anyone who had cooperated. These were not isolated deaths. They were collective erasures, hundreds beheaded in a day, bodies piled and left to rot, and the killing was often indiscriminate. The Taiping executed people for practicing traditional religion, for hiding food, for questioning orders. The Qing executed people for having lived under Taiping rule, for failing to resist, for seeming suspicious. Guilt was assumed. Innocence could not be proven. Investigation took time. Killing everyone was simpler. Scorched earth ensured that what could not be held would be destroyed. Armies burned crops before retreating so enemies could not harvest them. Villages were razed so they could not shelter anyone. Irrigation systems were wrecked so land could not be farmed. The stated purpose was denial of resources. The actual result was the same for civilians: starvation in landscapes that had once fed them. Entire regions became uninhabitable. Areas that had supported dense populations for centuries were reduced to wasteland. Fields reverted to wilderness. Villages vanished. Roads that had connected communities led only to ruins. The infrastructure of daily life, built over generations, was demolished in a handful of years. Famines spread beyond combat zones because agriculture depends on stability: planting, seasons, harvest, storage, transport. War erased that stability. Farmers were conscripted or fled. Fields became battlegrounds. Even where fighting was not constant, trade collapsed, and the systems that moved food from surplus to deficit broke down. Hunger radiated outward, crossing provincial lines like smoke. This famine was not a natural disaster. It was manufactured. China had fed itself before the rebellion. The war destroyed production and distribution at the same time. Breadbaskets turned into starvation zones. Cities that had fed millions could not feed thousands. People died of hunger created entirely by human decisions to keep burning and besieging and executing. Disease followed, as it always does when bodies are weakened and populations are forced to move. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, plague, names that mattered less than what they did. They spread through refugee columns, besieged cities, military camps. Soldiers carried infection between regions. Refugees brought it into places not yet touched by combat. Corpses left unburied became fuel for further sickness. Disease killed more than combat. A soldier might survive battle and die of cholera in camp. A civilian might escape execution and die of typhus on the road. A child might survive famine and die of dysentery from contaminated water. Disease became an invisible army, indiscriminate, relentless, always advancing. Entire provinces emptied. Some regions in southern and central China lost half their people or more, not to one catastrophe, but to years of accumulated death. Battles, massacres, executions, starvation, sickness, and flight into places where death was waiting anyway. The population did not only fall, it evaporated. Jiangsu, one of China's wealthiest and most populated provinces, suffered catastrophic decline. Cities that had held hundreds of thousands became ruins with scattered survivors. Rural districts that had been dense with farms and villages turned quiet and empty. An economic engine became a wounded landscape that would take decades to partially recover. As the numbers climbed, death lost its individuality. Early in the war, people counted, mourned, recorded. But when losses reached thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands each year, grief could not keep up. Death became a constant, background noise so persistent it stopped being processed. Numbness became a tool for survival. If you mourned every corpse, you could not function. If you understood the full scale of what was happening, you would collapse. So people adapted by refusing to look directly at it. They stepped around bodies and kept walking. They lost family and continued moving. The alternative was paralysis. The alternative was madness. The war had no front lines because it was not a conventional fight over territory. The Taiping aimed to destroy the Qing and impose their kingdom. The Qing aimed to eliminate the Taiping and restore control. Both goals required controlling populations, not just defeating armies. That meant controlling food, movement, belief, loyalty, everything. The entire war zone became the battlefield. Battles erupted where civilians lived and worked, in cities, villages, farmland. Civilians were not collateral damage on the margins. They were embedded inside the conflict, unable to extract themselves. War was not an event that visited them. It was the atmosphere they breathed. Suffering was uneven. Coastal areas protected by foreign interests remained relatively stable. The far north and far south saw less direct combat, but the Yangtze River Valley, China's economic and agricultural heart, was devastated with particular thoroughness. The richest regions became the most ruined. Millions fled. Refugee columns poured into provinces not yet consumed by fighting, bringing starvation, disease, and desperation. Places that were still standing were overwhelmed by displaced populations who strained local food and shelter, spread infection, and sometimes turned to banditry when survival demanded it. The war's misery expanded far beyond the areas where armies marched. Outside China, the world watched with horror and caution. Western powers had treaties with the Qing and generally favored dynastic restoration, but their involvement was shaped by commerce. They did not want the Taiping to win. Taiping expansion threatened trade and foreign settlements, but they also did not commit major forces until late. They protected their interests while the interior burned, and as the war ground on year after year, the question shifted. It was no longer simply who would win. It was whether China itself would survive long enough for anyone to claim victory at all. The Qing military was coming apart. The armies meant to suppress the Taiping were corrupt, undisciplined, and increasingly useless. Soldiers were not paid, so they looted. Officers embezzled funds meant for campaigns. Units refused to fight when supplies failed or wages disappeared. The Green Standard Army and the Manchu Banner Forces, the old spine of imperial power, could not defeat the Taiping, and often could not even contain them. Defeats piled up. Expeditions launched from Beijing collapsed in the field. Commanders blamed each other. Orders issued from the capital were ignored by generals who understood those orders were impossible or suicidal or both. The chain of command was broken in practice, even if it still existed on paper. Everyone could see it, and everyone knew what it meant. The empire was losing the ability to defend itself. Survival demanded new methods. Regional officials were authorized to raise local militias, and they began creating armies that did not depend on the decaying imperial machine. Forces like Zheng Guofan's Xiang Army and Li Hongzhang's Huai Army were funded locally, loyal to their commanders more than the throne, and effective precisely because their leaders had direct stakes in victory. Zheng Guofan, a Confucian scholar turned commander, understood that the Taiping could not be defeated by half-hearted campaigns. He built the Xiang Army on discipline, logistics, and ideological opposition. Neo-Confucian values set deliberately against Taiping Christianity. He recruited from his home province, so soldiers fought to protect their own communities. He paid them regularly. He enforced order brutally. His army worked because it was not built on corruption, but the solution carried poison inside it. These regional forces answered to their commanders first. They were funded by local taxes that previously would have flowed to Beijing. They operated beyond imperial oversight. The dynasty was buying survival by empowering men who could one day threaten the center themselves. The Qing fought a rebellion by building the foundations of warlord power. Foreign powers intervened as the war threatened their interests. Western nations had already forced treaties on China and opened ports for trade. The Taiping disrupted commerce and threatened treaty port stability. At first, foreign powers were cautious. Some were even intrigued by Taiping claims of Christianity. But as the rebellion's radicalism and destructiveness became undeniable, they shifted toward supporting the Qing. A symbol of this shift was the ever-victorious army, first commanded by the American Frederick Townsend Ward and later by the British officer Charles Gordon. It was never large, only a few thousand troops, but it was trained, equipped and disciplined in ways most Qing forces were not. Its victories carried an unmistakable message. Western methods worked, and China's survival would require change. That assistance came with a cost. Foreign powers demanded more concessions, more access, more legal protections for their citizens. The Qing were being preserved even as they were further bound to foreign influence. China was being saved at the price of sovereignty, surviving in name while its autonomy was carved into pieces. Meanwhile, the war fractured into multiple wars. The Taiping fought the Qing in central provinces, but weakness at the center opened space everywhere. The Nean Rebellion erupted in the north. The Miao Rebellion ignited in the southwest. Muslim rebellions in the northwest declared independence. These uprisings were not coordinated, but they shared the same oxygen: Qing weakness, local oppression, economic collapse, and ethnic tension. The dynasty was not facing one threat. It was facing dozens, any one of them serious, together nearly fatal. The Qing could not suppress everything at once. Resources thrown against the Taiping were not available elsewhere. Winning in one province meant losing in another. The dynasty was playing a strategic game it could not truly win, trying to hold a territory too large with resources too depleted against enemies too numerous. Commerce collapsed under the weight of sustained warfare. The Grand Canal, China's primary north-south artery, ran through war zones and was repeatedly blocked. Coastal shipping was threatened by Taiping forces and by pirates who fed on chaos. Merchants could not move goods safely. Markets stopped functioning. Economic activity contracted into survival. China's export engines were hit hard. Tea-growing regions became battlegrounds. Silk production required stability that no longer existed. Foreign traders found supplies unreliable or unavailable. China's position in global trade weakened, and with it, the revenue the Qing needed to keep fighting. In combat zones, agricultural destruction was nearly total. Fields became battlefields or were left unplanted because farmers were dead, displaced, or conscripted. Irrigation systems were wrecked and left unrepaired. Livestock was slaughtered by armies that needed food immediately. The base that supported China's massive population was being stripped away faster than it could regenerate. Regions that had once exported food began importing, if they could, or simply starved. The Qing tax system, already corrupt and fragile, collapsed entirely in many provinces. The government could not collect revenue from land it did not control, or from places with nothing left to tax. State finances fell into catastrophic deficit. Money itself became unstable. The Qing printed currency to fund operations, and inflation followed. The Taiping issued their own money in controlled territory. Multiple currencies circulated with unpredictable value. People hoarded silver and rejected paper. Trade that depended on stable exchange became almost impossible. The empire's infrastructure decayed in full view. Roads went unmaintained. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. Postal networks failed. The connective tissue of governance, communication, transport, administration began to tear. China was not only fighting, it was decomposing as a functional state. The social fabric shredded with it. Families were broken by death and displacement. Communities were erased. Trust evaporated because everyone might be an enemy, an informant, or simply hungry enough to betray. Cooperation, one of the quiet foundations of civilization, became dangerous. Banditry exploded. Former soldiers, displaced peasants and opportunists formed armed groups that raided to survive. They were not part of an organized rebellion. They were the symptom of collapse itself. In some districts, bandit gangs became the only organized force left, turning them into de facto authorities in a landscape where the state no longer reached. Even the scholar official class, China's administrative memory, was being hollowed out. Many were killed by the Taiping as representatives of the old order. Others died defending their towns or fled to safer provinces. Capacity vanished along with people. Governance becomes impossible when the people who know how to govern are gone. Entire generations were erased. Young men died in combat by the millions. Children died from famine and disease. The population structure warped. Regions emerged from the war with far more elderly and far fewer young adults, gaps that would echo for decades in labor, family formation and recovery. Literacy declined. Schools closed because teachers were dead or displaced. Children grew up without education because survival replaced learning. Knowledge transmission, the quiet continuity of civilization, was interrupted. China was losing not only lives, but the accumulated understanding those lives carried, and with blood and treasure, the Qing hemorrhaged legitimacy. The mandate of heaven, the ideological foundation of imperial rule, began to feel like a hollow phrase. How could the dynasty claim heaven's favor while the empire burned? Among officials and intellectuals, dangerous questions grew louder. Had the Qing lost the mandate? Should they be replaced? As the empire bled from 1,000 wounds, the question stopped being whether the Qing could defeat the Taiping. It became whether anything recognizable as China would survive, no matter who claimed victory in the end. By 1864, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was collapsing from within and without. Purges had already destroyed much of its original leadership. Hong Xiuquan was increasingly detached, issuing edicts that sounded like revelation while the world around him disintegrated. Under Taiping control, people were starving. Desertion spread like infection. A movement that had seemed unstoppable a decade earlier was visibly dying. Zheng Guofan's Xiang army closed around Nanjing in a final siege that would last months. The city was already weakened by years of war and internal dysfunction. Supplies were nearly gone. The population was exhausted, desperate, hollowed out. But surrender was unthinkable. To surrender was to admit the heavenly mission had failed, an impossibility for true believers. So they endured what could not be endured. The siege was methodical. Zheng cut off supply routes and waited. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated past language. Starvation became total. People ate anything remotely edible. Cannibalism was no longer hidden, it was open. Bodies lay in the streets, and the living butchered them. The heavenly capital became a place stripped of heaven, stripped of humanity, reduced to pure survival. Hong Xiuquan died in June 1864, possibly by suicide, possibly by illness. His death was concealed for as long as possible because the leadership understood what it would do to the last remaining morale. But concealment could not fill the void. His son was named to replace him, a teenager set on a throne that was already collapsing. A boy could inherit a title. He could not inherit authority. On July 19, 1864, Qing forces breached Nanjing's walls. What followed was not battle. It was massacre. Soldiers flooded the city under orders to kill Taiping fighters, but discrimination collapsed in the rush of vengeance and exhaustion. Anyone inside was assumed Taiping. The killing lasted for days. Estimates place roughly 100,000 dead in the immediate aftermath of the city's fall. The defenders fought with suicidal desperation because capture meant death. Some set themselves on fire rather than be taken. Others killed their families and then themselves. The teenage Heavenly King was captured while trying to escape and executed. Any leadership that could be found was killed immediately. The movement's hierarchy was not defeated. It was severed. Reprisals spread far beyond Nanjing. As Qing forces reclaimed Taiping territory, executions followed in a deliberate, systematic rhythm. Soldiers were killed. Administrators were killed. Anyone who had held authority inside the Heavenly Kingdom was marked for elimination. The Qing were not only winning, they were attempting to erase participation itself. But erasure does not stop at leadership. Ordinary people who had lived under Taiping rule became suspects. How do you prove you were not a believer? How do you prove coercion instead of loyalty? In many places, you could not. Suspicion was enough. Thousands of the innocent died alongside the guilty. Reconquest became restoration braided with revenge. The scale of death defies comprehension. Estimates place the Taiping Rebellion's toll between 20 and 30 million, with some counts higher, making it the deadliest conflict of the 19th century and the deadliest civil war in human history until World War II. More people died in the Taiping Rebellion than in World War I. These numbers remain estimates because accurate counting was impossible. Entire districts were depopulated, records collapsed, graves were unmarked. Many bodies were never buried at all. The true number will never be known, but the emptiness was visible. Provinces that had been dense with life became quiet expanses of absence. Across southern and central China, infrastructure lay broken. Cities were ruins. Agricultural land was damaged or abandoned. Irrigation systems were shattered. Roads became impassable. Centuries of accumulated development were demolished in 14 years. Reconstruction would take decades, and even then it could not restore what had been erased. Families were not only killed, many were removed so completely that no one remained to remember them. Entire lineages ended. Villages vanished with no survivors to carry stories forward. The thread connecting generations, names, obligations, histories was cut. And in the silence that followed, people emerged disconnected from their own past. The psychological trauma was profound and largely unprocessed. Survivors carried experiences beyond ordinary integration: executions, starvation, mass flight, disease, the sight of cannibalism, the memory of killing and being hunted. But there was no framework to hold that damage, no support, no acknowledgement, no language that could make it safe to speak. So the trauma was buried. People did not talk about what they had lived through because talking made it real again, and because most listeners could not understand. The rebellion became a silence, a massive blank space in personal and collective memory where something too terrible to articulate had taken place. That silence did not end with the survivors. It seeped into the next generation. Children raised by traumatized parents inherited the consequences without the story. They grew up in homes where certain subjects were forbidden, where fear appeared without explanation, where the past was not a narrative but a void that shaped the present invisibly. The Qing survived, but survival came at a price that weakened it permanently. The dynasty had relied on regional leaders whose armies were loyal to commanders more than to the throne. It had accepted foreign intervention that demanded new concessions. It had demonstrated in front of the entire country that it could not govern effectively without improvising its own dismemberment. The economy recovered slowly and unevenly. Trade resumed, but China's position in global commerce was diminished. Agricultural production returned as populations rebuilt, but output remained below pre-rebellion levels for decades. The damage was not only visible in ruins, it persisted as poverty and reduced capacity, carried forward into generations that had never seen the war. The social order was altered in ways that could not be reversed. The scholar official class was decimated. Regional militaries gained power that the center could not easily reclaim. Social hierarchies were shaken by displacement, mobility, and the brutal leveling effect of sustained catastrophe. China emerged more fragmented, more militarized, more vulnerable, and the rebellions did not end. The Nean Rebellion continued in the north until 1868. Muslim uprisings in the West lasted into the 1870s. The Taiping had been the largest rupture, but it was not the only one. The empire spent the next half-century suppressing uprisings, confronting foreign pressure, and attempting reforms that came too late to prevent the dynasty's collapse in 1912. The Taiping Rebellion proved what happens when ideological certainty meets desperate populations. It began with genuine grievances and promises of change. It drew millions because existing conditions were intolerable. But the utopia it promised became a dystopia, and the liberation it offered became a different form of oppression. It also revealed how quickly complex societies can fall apart. China had carried institutional continuity for millennia. 14 years of war reduced regions to something close to pre-agricultural emptiness. The fragility beneath apparent stability was not theoretical anymore. It was proven. There were no monuments for the victims, no memorials for the millions who vanished. The Qing did not commemorate what happened, because remembrance would mean admitting how close the dynasty came to total collapse. The Taiping were condemned as rebels and heretics, dismissed as madness rather than examined as the symptom of a system failing under its own weight. And so China entered the late 19th century weakened and traumatized, alive but altered, stumbling forward into a world of imperial powers, ready to carve it into spheres of influence, while the dynasty that had barely survived one catastrophe drifted toward the next. Religion was not just motivation, it was a weapon. The Taiping weaponized faith in a way that made compromise impossible and death nearly inevitable. When Hong Xiuquan declared the Qing dynasty satanic, he did not create political opposition, he declared cosmic war. In cosmic war, neutrality is betrayal, mercy is weakness. You are either with heaven or with demons. That binary erased every outcome except total victory or annihilation. It also made the conflict resistant to normal solutions. Political rebellions can bargain. Economic crises can be met with reform. But when one side believes it is executing divine will and the other believes it is defending civilization against heresy, there is no middle ground to stand on. The Taiping could not accept anything less than the Qing's destruction. The Qing could not tolerate a rival authority claiming heaven's mandate. Faith-sustained commitment past the limits of reason. Soldiers who might have deserted a political cause fought to the death for a religious one. Communities that might have surrendered to preserve their lives chose destruction rather than betray what they believed were heavenly commands. Religion did not merely justify killing, it made dying meaningful. And once dying becomes meaningful, killing follows more easily. Population density turned violence into mass death. 19th century China held some of the densest concentrations of humans on Earth. The Yangtze River Valley and surrounding provinces contained hundreds of millions. When war erupted there, every siege, every battle, every scorched earth retreat crushed enormous numbers at once. A clash that might kill hundreds elsewhere killed thousands here because thousands were always present. That same density made disease spread with terrifying efficiency. Cholera in a small refugee camp is tragedy. Cholera in a camp holding tens of thousands becomes a multiplication engine. Famine in a sparsely populated region kills fewer by definition. Famine in a Chinese province becomes catastrophe measured in millions. The scale of suffering was built into the scale of the population trapped inside it. Then the food system collapsed and starvation began killing more than combat. China's agricultural machine was sophisticated, but it depended on stability, predictable seasons, maintained irrigation, secure transport, functioning markets. War destroyed all of it. Fields became battlegrounds, farmers became soldiers or refugees, irrigation systems were shattered, surplus vanished, and cities that had been fed by long supply chains found those chains cut. China had produced enough food to sustain itself before the rebellion, but production and distribution are separate worlds. Even when some regions still held surplus, warfare prevented moving it to places in need. Merchants could not travel. Routes were unsafe. The Grand Canal was blocked again and again. Food existed and could not reach the starving. Granaries held supplies that rotted while people died within sight of empty roads. Civil war dynamics made violence constant instead of episodic. This was not war between states with clean lines and civilians safely behind them. Civilians were embedded in the war zone. Front lines shifted or didn't exist at all. Distinguishing combatant from non-combatant became impossible, and that impossibility became license. Civil wars kill civilians disproportionately because loyalty is always suspected. The Taiping killed people suspected of Qing loyalty. The Qing killed people suspected of Taiping sympathy. Proof was rare. Suspicion was enough. Better to kill 10 innocents than allow one enemy to survive. That logic, repeated across millions of people and thousands of towns, produces millions of deaths. Total mobilization devoured the last remnants of normal life. The Taiping conscripted widely and placed women in combat roles unheard of in traditional society. The Qing raised regional militias that pulled entire communities into war. There was no civilian economy separate from war economy. Everything, labor, food, transport, administration, was redirected toward fighting. When the war destroyed resources, there were no reserves to fall back on. There was only the next demand. Ideology replaced compromise at every decision point. Politics can accept partial victories, shared power, negotiated losses. Ideology, especially religious ideology, cannot. The Taiping believed they were establishing heaven on earth. Compromise meant betraying God. The Qing believed they held the mandate of heaven. Compromise meant admitting they had lost it. Neither side could step back without collapsing its own legitimacy. So the war could end only with one side destroyed. There was no treaty both could sign without denying their own foundation. The Taiping had to conquer or be annihilated. The Qing had to eliminate the Taiping or accept the end of their rule. That meant the conflict continued until one side ceased to exist. Neither side had an exit strategy. The Taiping had no plan for failure because they believed heaven guaranteed victory. The Qing had no plan for coexistence because a rival claiming divine authority could not be tolerated. Wars without exits become wars of attrition. Whoever can keep losing people longest eventually wins, and the country loses either way. Death became administrative. On a small scale, each death is an event. Mourned, processed, remembered. At Taiping scale, death becomes routine, executing prisoners as procedure, clearing bodies as sanitation, starvation as the expected result of siege tactics. When killing becomes policy instead of choice, the moral friction disappears. You are not killing people. You are implementing security, processing enemies, enforcing order. The technology of the era made this worse in a particular way. Violence was efficient enough to be systematic, but not efficient enough to be quick. Firearms existed but were not universal. Much killing was done with blades, with fire, with hunger, with slow diseases moving through weakened bodies. Millions died not in an instant, but in drawn-out degradation, methods that required repeated human action and produced maximum suffering over time. The absence of meaningful international intervention allowed the killing to run its course. Foreign powers protected their commercial interests and treaty ports. They did not intervene to prevent mass death. The war was left to burn until exhaustion and annihilation brought it to an end. Duration deepened the damage. 14 years meant children born at the beginning grew into adolescence, knowing only instability and violence. A generation learned that death was ordinary, that trust was dangerous, that survival required hardness. Populations adapted to war, and that adaptation made war easier to sustain, which extended it further. The conflict fed itself. Violence produced refugees. Refugees strained resources. Strained resources produced new conflict. New conflict produced more violence. Famine produced desperation. Desperation produced banditry. Banditry disrupted agriculture. Disrupted agriculture worsened famine. Each response magnified the problem that created it. The system became trapped in spirals that accelerated instead of resolving. And because casualties were not reliably counted, they were not reliably acknowledged. When deaths are tracked, there is pressure, however weak, to limit them. When deaths vanish into silence, accountability dissolves. The Taiping did not systematically record what they killed. The Qing did not track civilian deaths. Millions died anonymously, and anonymity made it easier for millions more to follow. So when the war finally ended, survivors faced a question no one could answer. How do you rebuild a civilization when everything, the people, the infrastructure, the trust, even the memory, has been consumed by a catastrophe so total that it exceeds the human capacity to comprehend what has been lost? The Taiping Rebellion did not just kill people. It erased futures, it hollowed a civilization, it taught the modern world what happens when belief replaces governance. It was not a world war, but more people died than in most of them. Subscribe to Fragments of History, because some of history's worst disasters don't have monuments. They only have numbers.